Good evening. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. It's tape number 431, March the 7th, 1980, and this is side one of the tape. Those of you who are familiar with my radio tapes and the tape cassettes that go out by subscription know that for the past many years I do not get tangled in specific elections or primaries such as New Hampshire or Vermont or what goes on in South Carolina or Illinois. I feel the electoral process is totally controlled and manipulated, and my concern in selecting a president of the United States or a public official is what links do they have to the assassination committees, to the killers, to the covering up of the assassinations, and how those people who are part of the murder, part of the cover-up, move up into positions of power and take over a good part of our lives. It is my belief, and I say it over and over again, that the world is controlled by murder or blackmail, and it's how these people move that interests me. So if you take these tapes or hear me on the radio, I will not be doing an analysis each week of the electoral process. You can get that in the newspapers. As far as the election goes, my opinion of it is, as I stated in 1973 in The Realist, I wrote an article, the Senate Select Committee is part of the cover-up. That was the time that Senator Sam Ervin and Howard Baker, Sam Ervin, Howard Baker, and Lowell Weicker and others were investigating the Watergate charges. And I wrote then that the electoral process is such that the motives for going to the Watergate Hotel would never be told, that racism, prejudice, and fear of changing the status quo are so deeply embedded, this is a quotation of Mae Brussell, into our ruling class that there is a silent and tacit agreement to protect each other under the guise of national security, such as they used with the killing of President John F. Kennedy. The truth never come out at these investigations. I said it is impossible, the way the courts are constructed, to force any revelations that would damage the existing power structure. If Richard Nixon moves out of office, Spiro Agnew moves in, and Ronald Reagan will follow him. The depth of corruption and links to the sabotage will not be touched. A power base of manipulation and political dishonesty which funds all these men remains. Well, I wrote this in 73 before Nixon was impeached, but I wrote in 1972 my first published article that Nixon would be out of power because of Watergate. That was printed in the summer of 1972. By 73, when I published this, he was not yet out, but ready to be moved out, and he would appoint his vice president, Gerald Ford, a member of the Warren Commission that covered up the murder of John Kennedy, and then as vice president under Ford, Nelson Rockefeller, a close associate of George de Mohrenschildt, Lee Harvey Oswald's closest friend. Spiro Agnew was part of this inner team. Richard Nixon realized when he was going to fall out because of Watergate, he should get rid of Agnew right away, which he did very wisely. We can be grateful for that, at least. And instead of being shot and Agnew taking over, Nixon right away pulled the rug out from Spiro Agnew. And the selected man to follow these two men, Nixon, Agnew, was to be Ronald Reagan. Now, in 1972, at the time of Watergate, when Nixon was being moved out, Brzezinski from Columbia University, and actually from Poland, he doesn't even have, he doesn't speak English, he has a Polish accent. Brzezinski, a representative of I.G. Farben, and Mr. Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands, the Trilateral Commission was formed. The Bilderbergers as the international organization. The Trilateral was Germany, Japan, the United States. What they were doing was building a base of Rockefeller, Bernhard, and various people to form the Trilateral, Brzezinski, all of them, to form the Trilateral, to hold on to the power they had and not let Mr. Reagan get it after they had gotten rid of Agnew and Nixon, to squeeze out the power force that was behind Ronald Reagan. They put in George Bush to oppose Ronald Reagan as another Trilateral member, and what the elections are about is who will get the power structure at the top and how much influence they will have over foreign policy and the Pentagon. Jerry Ford announced this week that if he decides to run against Reagan as the popular candidate, that Reagan's too old, he'll appoint Henry Kissinger again to do his international work. There isn't a hair's breadth difference between Brzezinski, Kissinger, Ford, Bush, David Rockefeller, and Prince Bernhard, and they're pushing their weight now with a Stop Reagan movement. am sorry to say, but it is a fact, I believe, that even Ford and David Rockefeller look liberal to what you would get from Reagan. You have no idea what this man is like. Of course, we've had him in California, but he's been behind so many evil things, and he represents, to me, a matter of degree of bad and worse. And, of course, I can't support these trilateral candidates, but at the top, we're going to get evil fighting bad, and we can't win anyway. But I watched the manipulation of the way the trilaterals were formed. I have received letters asking me to do tapes on the difference between the Bilderberger, the trilateral, and their base of power, which I promised to do not too long from now. If I haven't done enough of it, I'll do some more. I thought I did some tapes on trilateral way back, but I'll do more and clarify that on the candidates. There was an election I was interested in. It was described in the Washington Post last week in the University of Virginia. A young black student was running for office, Karen Rose. She's from the District of Columbia, and she was running for an office at the University of Virginia in student government. And her parents live in Washington. Her father works as a stockbroker. The mother is a librarian at the State Department. Karen is black. She got telephone calls calling her a nigger bitch and threatening to kill her if she ran for office, so she was forced to quit. The man running with her for student government, Ron Suskind, is Jewish, and he received phone calls calling him a Heb and told him to withdraw or they would fry him and that he would also be killed. So student government in University of Virginia is controlled by death threats. It isn't much different than the higher level, and I'm sure it's happening all over the country. A black man who was in the military for 20 years or so, 20, 30 years, retired on the Monterey Peninsula, ran for the airport board last year, and he was invited to lunch where two men as much as said, you know, if you want to stay alive, no black man runs for the airport board on the Monterey Peninsula, and he didn't run again. The threats are real, and the people close to the persons delivering the threats realize they're real, and this is why you get this homogeneous white society running every campus, almost every campus in the United States, and also working their way up into the political system, because if they're not killed off or run over or poisoned or given acid or some other thing, they can get telephone calls that just threaten to kill them. And I believe that the University of Virginia isn't the only isolated university where these things are happening. There are a lot of stories in the news that I'm going to bypass this week because I want to get right to ABSCAN if I can. But we'll be following up in the next few weeks that murder of Jeannie and Al Mills out in California, and the sperm banks, the New Mexico prison riots, the new information about the Ku Klux Klan with the Martin Luther King murder, that sunken ship off the China coast I mentioned briefly last week, the Carter connections to narcotics, the Colombia connections to narcotics and the hostages there, the update of the most current 60 or 80 deaths that are in the news that are important, evidence that's being destroyed, and there's a lot I want to talk to you about. The Moonies and their organization called Oceanic. We've talked about Oceanic with Frank Turple and George Corcola as a CIA front and used by Oceana 1984, George Orwell, but the use of that term by the Nazis, sabotage on the wharf, New York City during World War II. The Moonies have now named their fishing operation Oceanic International Organization. I think that's a key word, and it's a very important one. But before I get to ABSCAN, I just have to briefly mention this California kidnapping, because everything out here is crazier than what you get on the East Coast. You can get international news from the New York Times and Washington news from the Washington Post, but it really takes California, which is the center of the cinema, the music, the television, the hub of the acting, the surreal. California, the center of the mind control experiments, the zombies, the robots, the J. Walter Thompson representing Chile, Argentina, the Los Angeles police, the San Francisco police, Richard Nixon, the public relations offices, Robert Mayhew, the youth organizations, the subterfuge, the drug traffic, the fantasies. California has it all, and I've spoken on tapes about the book California, the First Parafascist Nation. So we get this ridiculous or scary kidnapping. And, of course, it was interesting to me, this boy who is now 14 years old, who was missing 7 years, and then the young boy that was taken, because I remember in New York City, there were posters in Greenwich Village this last summer when I was there of a little boy that was missing. And ever since I read the book Alternative 3 on the Nazis and the intent to erase minds, to make people adaptable, to live up in space stations. And I have many articles I want to update for you on the space stations of Gerard O'Neill and Rockwell International, building these colonies for minerals and so forth, and the articles on mind control and necessity to genetically mutate people to adapt up there. I'm always interested in missing people. So when this 7-year-old boy was kidnapped for 7 years, taken when he was 7, and when he was 14, he left with another little boy who had just been kidnapped 2 weeks, and the two of them show up together. This is just one more saga of our California mysteries. Now, as I say, when I study missing people, I think of the possibilities of alternative 3. An important part of this Parnell, who took this boy, the first boy, when he left California, was that he had an accomplice, a very innocent-looking man who cling stoves at Yosemite National Park, and he took this boy away and kept him 7 years, and he went to school, and he went into towns like Santa Rosa, and he was a good, average, at least above average high school student, but when he got to town, he said he didn't know his way home, he didn't know where to go, he couldn't even walk up to a person and say, take me to a police station, I was kidnapped. He would be out loose, he was everywhere, and he didn't know what to do or where to go. Now this Parnell, as soon as he was arrested, the man charged with these crimes of taking the two boys, the psychiatrists get into a very detailed description of his past life, that when he was 14 or so or younger, he was molested, that when he was arrested as a juvenile offender, that he was arrested on a sex charge in Bakersfield, that he served 3 years in San Quentin, that he came back on a parole that was revoked. And they go through a lot of the details of his life until they get to 1967. Then 1967 to 1972 is a total blank. They also know that earlier in his life that he was in Utah. Utah was a place that Gary Gilmore was sent from Oregon, and he was a victim of a mind control program and electrodes and electroshocks and massive experimentation before he asked to be given the death penalty, a big hero, subject of book, future movie, and so forth. This man was in Phoenix, Arizona. Of course, Arizona and Sindona has a mind control center for experimentation and turning people into zombies. That doesn't mean the whole state is, but this man ends up in Ukiah, the home place of Jim Jones, and it's a very religious group. The boy was originally kidnapped, Stainer, by asking him to donate something to the church, and he called the man Dad, similar to the men called Jim Jones Dad, and the families were very religious. It's church-oriented, and the first day that the story broke, there was a lot of God and crucifix and church, but then that was kind of put in the background a few days later. This person went to Yosemite for a while, and then they traveled, and they lived in a trailer park, and they lived up north, and the last 4 months are detailed that Parnell worked in Ukiah, the home of Jones, and these various inns and experimentation places, and up in Mendocino County. He worked there 4 months at a hotel as a bookkeeper and a security guard. These people are always involved in security. Now, when Ukiah Hotel up there has a fairly decent hotel and has a security guard, it's interesting they do any check on sex perversions, on past criminal lives, on armed robberies in Utah, stealing cars. He's been in jails in Utah. He's told to get out of Utah and never return. He's been in San Quentin. He's been in juvenile halls. And he's a mathematical genius who does bookkeeping. It doesn't explain where he got his bookkeeping. Always look for the money. There used to be a saying, cherchez la femme, look for the woman in the case. There's no women in this case yet, but look for the money. Where did he work from the time he took this young person in 1972? They picked him up in an automobile. Another man arrested. Yosemite had the automobile, but Parnell had his own car. Who paid for the gas? Except for the 4 months in Ukiah where he's at the hotel as a security guard. There isn't any employment or location from 1967 to 1972. Now, I'll do more details on this case later. As I say, I want to get back to ABSCAM. But it's very interesting that he stayed at a trailer park, but there's certain basic things that all people need. One is rent. 2 is transportation, gasoline, oil, grease, tires, and so forth. 1 is clothes. The 3rd is clothes. The food is some medical care like immunization or shots or treatment at a doctor's. When you enroll a child in a school, you usually have to bring the birth certificate the first time. This isn't mentioned how he had this boy in school 7 years and no identity. When you register them because of the age and putting them in certain classes, you have your birth certificate. But rent, transportation, food, housing, and where you live is always important. Now, they say he lives in a trailer park. What was the down payment? What did they pay? Who did they live with? Were these CIA safe houses and mind control experiments for abducting children? Perfectly happy. The second little boy thought it was a lark. Were they given food or chemicals? Was anything put in their food to make them happy? That there was no resistance? They show no trauma. They're perfectly placid. They would have been happy to be there, just like people went off to Jonestown and thought it was wonderful paradise. These children have families, but they didn't show any trauma about being away. It was the one boy said that he was, Standard said he was spoiled. He treated him very nice. What do you give children when you spoil them? You can't live in a shack, no toilet, no water, no toys, no television, anything, and just be perfectly happy in a zombie state after living with family, with a lot of siblings and activity and so forth. So the question is the rent, the housing, the transportation, the clothing, the medicine, and the care, and where was this Parnell working all these years, and why are 2 or 3 people involved in abducting and then leaving? There's a story in 1975 that Parnell called Mr. Murphy in Yosemite and said he needed some money. What was he doing all that time until the last 4 months when the case was being closed? What was he doing for money? And if he needed money, there was never a ransom, never a request of money from the families at all. So why would Murphy be supplying money to Parnell? He hasn't seen him in a few years. They simply abducted a boy for him, went back to clinging stoves, and the other one travels around with him. And so the answer to this case, the answer, of course, is not the little shack they were living in when they were found, or the fact that there's a fondness for each other, that they developed this relationship. The answer to what happened in the form of mind control has to do with this Mr. Murphy. It has to do with the third mystery man. It has to do with the placid relationship that these people developed, just simply existing, doing their work or going to school with no anxieties, no apparent anxieties of any kind, and no interest in escaping or going home. The real story has to do with not only Utah and the California prisons, but it has to do with the years from 1965, particularly, to 1972. Mr. Parnell's mother, who lives in Bakersfield, said that he used to come visit on the weekends. He didn't have anybody with him. He drove down from San Francisco, and she saw him 3 or 4 times a year. If she's not lying, then what was happening to the Parnell boy? Was he staying alone in the cabin, or if they weren't in that cabin, where were they? Now, always in these cases, there's rent-free. People are good to them. They can live on nothing because people are good. In this case, they were watching a sheep ranch, so the rent was free for their little cabin that they lived in. It wasn't luxurious, but it was rent-free. But what about the other places that they rented, and where did he work? What kinds of occupation? Where did he learn to be a security guard, a bookkeeper, and what was he doing from the time he left the prisons through the years that he had the child? And when the Mills were murdered, Al and Jeannie Mills, I understand that there were diaries in her closet in a safe, and that she was writing a book about Jim Jones and Jonestown. And it has to do, of course, with Mendocino and Ukiah, because they set that up from 1969 up through 1975. Are there stories about other kidnappings? Are there stories of how they got their children? Because, you see, I believe that Jim Jones had children that didn't belong to him. I believe the people were face down. And I mentioned this so you couldn't identify or recognize them. And what if other kidnapped children were taken there? What if there was a business of taking children down there or planning to experiment on these people, and that this was a test case to abduct and remove people for learning to live in isolated places that could be like space stations that Gerard O'Neill is building now, designing at Princeton University. Our newspapers out here are filled with information on this. From what I understand, in the East Coast and Midwest and northern part of the country, you're not getting any information on this. That's probably because you have other missing children, too, and they don't want to play it up too much. It could be a national pattern that's taking place, and they're going to try to localize it to a couple of nuts in California rather than a large national program, even though Jim Jones went from California to Detroit to the Southwest to the East Coast of Pennsylvania and so forth, recruiting to get people into Jonestown, and had the technology to take these people away. This placid young man going into adulthood, living with Parnell, was up in Ukiah, Mendocino. They resided a great many years right up in the Jonestown area and were involved with church activities or referred to churches, and the truth yet about their possible links to Jonestown aren't out, but they certainly should be explored. The investigation known as ABSCAM is much, much more than just an Arab seducing a few congressmen into a house in Washington where there's cameras and they put some money in their pockets, or in a hotel in New York or in Florida. It's a broad investigation that would link to the bulk of the corruption that's going on in the United States. And of course, members of Congress are very nervous about it. I mentioned when it first came down and I realized the cast of characters that were involved, that it went right to Jimmy Carter and even his narcotic connections, and I referred to it as the Carter Gate, that it would be equivalent to Nixon's Watergate if it falls out properly and gets investigated. The Soho Press in New York, February 13, 1980, says the U.S. Attorney General pulled the plug on the ABSCAM when he became appalled at its scope and the possible ramifications to the Carter administration. That's exactly what I said, and Mr. Civiletti was formed to allow leaks to take place. He was going to cover the investigation up, and I understand there were some people in New York that were afraid he would cover it up, so they let a little bit of it out. Thomas Puccio of the Justice Department was working with Newsday and New York Times. Neil Welch, the head of the New York FBI office, has been accused of making the leaks in order to keep the case subdued. In other words, they named the people before the grand jury could call them or before they were arrested, and this makes them look like they're victims of the press. Neil Welch, incidentally, as head of the FBI office in New York, was the one who did prosecute or get an indictment against Michael Sindona and against Mr. Scotto. Those are two of the links to Jimmy Carter. And he also interviewed all of the Jonestown people that worked with the Central Intelligence Agency. Then the CIA immediately destroyed all the records of Jonestown in Washington, D.C. But Welch has been instrumental in the Sindona case, which is linked to the ABSCAM, and to the Scotto case, which is linked to Jimmy Carter and ABSCAM, and he was the head of the New York FBI office, and he's been charged with leaking the case so that the defendants would really scatter and go loose, and they would have to stop some more of their investigation before the case was really tightened up. They've accused Newsday's Anthony Morrow of working on the story months before the arrest took place, and New York Times' Leslie Maitland. There's a question, did the Justice Department give her article? When the New York Times story broke about ABSCAM, one person referred to it not as an article, but a document, and they said it was just right out of the Justice Department that Maitland had prosecution memos. Imagine how the press and the news people get prosecution memos and information before the case is fully investigated. The Justice Department simply can't hit on organized crime because it hits every area, almost every single politician that's in Washington, D.C. In fact, there was a quotation in the New York paper this week that if they went into the ABSCAM investigation the way they should, that 50% of the Congress would be knocked out that would be involved with organized crime and payoffs. And that's why for national security they have to cover it up. General Haig investigated Richard Nixon's link to organized crime and was able to get him out of power easily by covering up the links of the people that he represented in crime and pulling the rug out under Richard Nixon. So the important events that are investigated by the law enforcement agency are leaked to the news media in the hopes that then the investigation has to be stopped or the people can get an easy trial. This Michael Sindona that I speak so much about on the tapes, who is an investment banker for the Vatican, responsible for looting $45 million from the Franklin National Bank in New Jersey, and not unrelated to John Murphy from New York City and ABSCAM investigations. His trial is going on right now, and in the course of the trial, they sent the jury out of the room. This is from the Daily News, February 14th, 1980. the jury was sent out of the room while Mr. Frankel discussed Michael Sindona, and there were allegations that Sindona laundered money in one of his Italian banks for the Freemasons. Here's an investment broker or banker for the Vatican who's taking the money away to give to the Freemasons. The attorney went on, according to the Daily News, and Bordini claimed, this is Bordini, the main prosecution witness, claimed that Sindona was involved with the Central Intelligence Agency, that he once owned the Rome Daily American, which was a CIA paper, and that he had mob connections. Other articles have his mob connections to Carlo Gambino family, which is linked to the worst congressman, John Murphy, who has been named in the ABSCAM story, and also these people have common ground with the people behind Jimmy Carter. The serious people trying to investigate ABSCAM are being stopped so that it will not Cartergate, this trilateralist who's in power, and whether or not they can put the lid on it, at least through the elections like they did with Nixon and Watergate. It seems that they're going to hush down and play down ABSCAM now, and not Cartergate Carter, but it's going to come out later for sure. When there's a subject that is very broad, like Jonestown or Alternative 3, the space stations and so forth, I like to give you a working outline of some of the areas that I've broken the subject down into, because it's impossible to do tapes just an hour a week and cover all of the material. So I'm going to give you a direction of areas to look for that I have broken ABSCAM into, and then go into a few of the points today and hopefully continue on it because it is so important. In the first category that I've broken down is the attack against the investigation of the Justice Department of members of Congress and organized crime. That goes in the category of the National Labor Party. They have articles, ABSCAM is to usher in a Gestapo, and they're against ABSCAM. They're putting down the investigation as being prejudiced and bringing in a police state rather than throwing out organized crime. I'll go into that a little more today. But there are people that are putting down the investigation, the ACLU, the same people that defend the Nazis. The ACLU defends freedom of speech, but it puts down ABSCAM before they even have tried or prosecuted a single witness. And in a democracy, I think they should at least hold their opinion and see what's going on. I save all the articles that attack the idea that there should be these 80 or 90 investigations of organized crime going on. Those that defend the right to investigate and say it should be investigated, such as Mr. Pottinger from the Justice Department. The purpose of the ABSCAM probe, I've listed all the various motives and purposes. Then I have a section on the three major informers, on how the story started to break. They didn't just say, well, let's go look for these labor leaders or these organizers or the liberals of the Democratic Congress and let's really get them out. There were three informers, Philip Ketzer, Melvin Weinberg, and Joseph Meltzer. And I have a lot of information from the media newspapers of their network from California to Florida, Philadelphia, New Jersey, New York. This is how ABSCAM began, with these men getting off of arrest, saving their own ass by giving information of bigger crooks. Then the FBI agents, the personalities of those in charge, such as Mr. Welch that I mentioned. Welch was working with the FBI in Philadelphia, and I have articles where he describes Philadelphia as a cesspool of corruption, which it was, and of organized crime. And he went on, as I say, to prosecute Michael Sindona and Mr. Scotto in New York. He got out of Philadelphia because it was so bad. The FBI has at least 50 more cases, and I have a list of what Mr. Webster says his goals were when he started out, and his attack of crime in the suites. Then there's the geographical areas of the actual crimes being investigated, the criminal investigation. There's the Southwest investigation that's known as BRILAB. There's the Philadelphia connections. And members of Congress like Representative Lederer and Representative Meyer are the protégés of Rizzo, the police chief who was identical to the Nazi Gestapo, one of the most feared police chiefs in the United States. You can hardly call these the liberals of Congress, people that are working like John Murphy with the Shah of Iran, a graduate of West Point, a buddy of Somoza, working with the Korean CIA and Nicaragua's police chiefs and assassination teams and so forth. The men that have been named in ABSCAM are hardly the darlings or the liberals, and they haven't been picked out just because they were so liberal. Lederer and Meyer, as I say mentioned in the Philadelphia connections, are the direct protégés of Rizzo and the fascist police system that was extremely right-wing, particularly the anti-war movement and with minorities and so forth. On the other side of this tape, we'll devote the next 30 minutes to ABSCAM, the outlines and certain personalities involved. This is Mae Brussell at side 2 of tape 431, March the 7th, 1980, from Carmel, California. I want to continue to give you some of the categories of ABSCAM that I am researching. Of course, you can see by the titles, each one deserves a separate tape, but I want you to know the direction it's going and what I'm thinking so you can follow some of the news more carefully. There are articles now about U.S. Attorney General Degner from New Jersey, linking and connecting the mob of Atlantic City to the mob in Las Vegas. I've been following that ever since the Howard Hughes organization moved in 1966 and took over control of the vast majority of the clubs in Las Vegas, and I've referred to this as the takeover, the beginning of the Irish mob moving in on the territory of the Italian Jewish and getting rid of Bugsy Siegel and Mickey Cohn and that gang. That Mo Dallas is still very powerful, and he's down at La Costa and has links to people involved in ABSCAM, such as Carlos Marcello or the Bry Lab, Alan Dorfman, and Teamsters. Goodness knows they're strongly connected to those people in Chicago. But for the most part, what you're getting in New Jersey and in Las Vegas is a moving shift to the Central Intelligence Agency, the Eastern Seaboard, the more elite power structure of the United States and Great Britain moving in to New Jersey as they took over Nevada and having the control over organized crime in this country, or at least attempting to, putting organized crime families into, in quotes, respectable businesses or killing them off and then taking over the turf for themselves. And, of course, the government has been involved with protecting narcotic dealers and bringing in on our airplanes, such as Air America and so forth. Since the Vietnamese War, we have been pushing that stuff across our borders and allowing it in now from Afghanistan, Turkey, and Pakistan, and that arch of heroin and poppy that's flooding the United States at the present time. I have a category here on Representative Jenrette, again, another person not picked out because of his great left leanings. He's been linked to organized crime, to drugs. Jack Anderson had an article recently on him and a lobby for millions of dollars to encourage tourism to the United States. That kind of tourism promoted by Jenrette could continue the narcotics traffic, and he's linked to one of those provocateurs, Mr. Weinberg, that I mentioned in the Bahamas, with deals down the Bahamas. Then there's the Chase Manhattan links, as always. The bank was used for part of the funding of ABSCAM, but that lets them have a control of the Justice Department to know what's going on and help move out a certain faction if they want. The vice president of Chase Manhattan was a front for money going through, just as in the book Man Called Intrepid by William Stevenson, British intelligence used Rockefeller Center for the intelligence operations during World War II. The Chase Manhattan has been one of the fronts, I'm sure just a small one, but a front for banking for ABSCAM. There also is an operation called All Stamp and MyPorn. One's the pornography. There's another one on the music business. Besides the Teamsters and labor and congressmen and gaming tables and narcotics traffic and so forth, All Stamp has to do with tax money, your tax money and mine, allegedly feeding the poor. They're food stamps that are printed, and they're converted into money that goes to the PLO, the Palestinian group, for violence over the Middle East, to bomb women and children on buses and schools or whatever. They go to weapons and shipping of weapons, converting food stamps to weapons. And this is one of the things that the FBI is investigating. There also is a 9th congressman who's involved, and they refuse to name who he is. It's very much like covering up the Watergate story, the Kennedy assassination. We have one senator Then there's the 7 members of the House of Representatives named in the ABSCAM, and there's a 9th congressman, but they've been holding back the name for 2 weeks. There's Senator Williams, very closely linked to labor movements for the last years, who blew his role with OSHA, with the occupational safety, and something very funny happens in an area that is predominantly working class, poor, working people that Williams represented, and all of a sudden the casino and the mom moves in, and then he's international. His wife is on the board of directors of a group that's bringing in London gambling casinos and so forth. And then Senator Williams, like Senator John Murphy, who never was a great liberal, a graduate of West Point rather, with Somoza, has no money and all of a sudden comes into the chips and has hundreds of thousands of dollars in expensive homes. Something funny happens when they see all that money. So that Senator Williams is a category by himself. And then there's the New Jersey casino state officials such as Mr. Silvestri, Mr. Araschetti, an attorney Howard Crichton, and U.S. Attorney Del Tufo. As I said before, he was appointed by Carter. So if you have a Cartergate and the U.S. attorney is investigating, it's sort of like Abel Younger, the Attorney General from California, investigating Richard Nixon, or Operation the Squad 19 that was going to kill Nixon in California, that was linked to the Watergate team with Hunt and McCord. U.S. attorneys appointed by the president can't investigate organized crime that's linked to the president, and a lot of crime is in New Jersey. There also is an attorney Feinberg who's involved in all of this, and the U.S. Customs Office in Newark, New Jersey, and also the U.S. Customs in New York. Now, the use of customs is very important and deserves its own category, because this is where you get drug dealers, immigration right-wing people, army factions, and international terrorists that can be brought in. The immigration gives passports to people who can be crooks, who come to this country with endless money, unlimited money. There was 60 Minutes had a show on the chief of police of Iran, who's living in Fresno, California, who just purposely set fire to a theater where 600 people were killed. He was given a passport and contact with the CIA and controlled by the CIA in this country. The immigration department is very important when you have millions and millions of dollars and a criminal wants to escape and lose himself in California or wherever he goes. But we're getting a bulk of it out here now. So there are categories of current drug arrests that are taking place because of the shift of the operations in New Jersey, or the possible exposure, and then the drug murders or recent deaths of witnesses or heart attacks that are affecting these cases that are linked to this international organization. I mentioned last week that the judge on the Hells Angels trial out here in California had 2 heart seizures, and he's laid up, and there's articles that I'll go into in a few weeks about that case, whether they should throw it out. Sonny Barger was an agent of alcohol, tobacco, and firearms. They were involved in murders, an anti-war movement, beating up hippies, anti-war people, distributing drugs at rock concerts, and they worked as agents, murdering and so forth. And so the important thing is that when the cases come to court, those judges get sick, and now they don't know whether the case will be dropped or what will happen to all the defendants because the judge is in the hospital with a heart seizure. Should they drop the whole case? Federal agents that are involved in these crimes do get acquitted. I am keeping a separate category or a list of the most prominent people who are objecting to the FBI making these arrests. As a matter of fact, the only man arrested so far is one fellow from the Immigration Department in New York. They haven't even pulled that ABSCAM net yet, and releasing the news to the press may have saved some of these people from being indicted, although I believe John Murphy of New York is going to be indicted, and Senator Williams. But I keep articles like Senator Byrd objecting to ABSCAM, or Don Edwards from the House of Representatives objecting to the investigation. He used to be formerly with the FBI. There are very few times that I have ever protected or thought highly of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. In my 16 years research, I've had nothing but contempt because of their role with assassination teams, with their working with Permindex, with known assassins, with organized crime, and the network of criminal activity they're involved in is greater than the amount of solving of crimes that they do. You notice how FBI are supposed to investigate kidnappings, and they didn't have that little boy 2 weeks missing in California, gave himself up, walked to the police station, and the one that was kidnapped 7 years walked with him. The FBI didn't find either of them, even though they were easily available or could be found without any problems, considering that they were out in the open, living fairly out in the open, one going to school and so forth. But the important thing about FBI is that every once in a while a corrupt institution does have people that want to do the work, and you can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Every agent isn't bad any more than every police agent. That's why it's easy to do research, is that there are enough good people telling you things that you can follow through. And I save articles for people that are fighting the ABSCAN, and I mentioned once before on a tape the National Labor Party had an article. They've been putting down the ABSCAM investigation. One article that I quoted, ABSCAM to usher in the Gestapo, the National Labor Party. And now I'm opening up a can of worms because one listener in particular is very interested in this newspaper, the New Solidarity, and in the research they have done. I have another friend who's close to the National Labor Caucus and believes in Mr. LaRoche, and he gave me the subscription again to New Solidarity when mine ran out at Christmas. Gave me a year's subscription, so it's coming again. And this is a can of worms. Of all the hundreds of people who take the tapes, or maybe thousands who hear this program on radio stations, I only know of one person, only one single person, who absolutely believes what LaRoche prints and almost everything that he says. And I can't have a running debate on this issue, point by point. I would rather wait till instances come out to illustrate the differences that I have with Lyndon LaRoche and his research and where he's coming from, because you can't, as I say, take each issue and break it apart. But when they first came out with an article on ABSCAM, there was one, is Carter blackmailing Nevada's Senator Cannon? And it has to do with deregulating Teamsters and the trucking industry, as if you could blackmail Cannon on that. There's a lot more that you could blackmail him on, and it's possible that he is. But then, and I referred to this before in a tape, ABSCAM to usher in the Gestapo. And in this article by Kathleen Murphy, it says, one such investigation, Brylab, broke in the news today. Brylab implicates key elements of organized crime, particularly Teamsters, in bribery and kickbacks involving crime figures in the Southwest. Also are implicated several federal officials and elected officials of several states. Well, certainly any organization that publishes a book called Dope Incorporated, Britain's Opium War Against the United States, shouldn't object or be so harsh on the fact that Brylab, as part of ABSCAM, is going to go into organized crime involving bribery and kickbacks, because Brylab involves not only that, but then you get into drug dealers, which takes you to Dope Incorporated. Now, I have the book Dope Incorporated, and I said many times I'd do a tape on it. And I am a promise breaker. The news takes precedence sometimes. But in the index of that book, if you look very carefully, and this goes to the ABSCAM investigations and the characters that are being named or implicated, they leave out the name of Joseph Bonanna and the Bonanna family and crime, Russell Bufalini and their CIA connections, and William Bufalina, the Alan Dorfman connections. Alan Dorfman is not mentioned in Dope Incorporated, even though he's part of the Brylab connections. They leave Frank Fitzsimmons out, Carlo Gambino, Sam Giancano. There's one page on Jimmy Hoffa. They leave out La Costa and the headquarters for organized crime, and Carlos Marcello, except for in being involved in the Kennedy assassination. There's several references to him, but not being head of the whole Marseille connection. They leave out the name Roland McMaster, Aristotle Onassis, Anthony Provenzino, John Rosselli, and Santos Traficanta. Now, the name Roland McMaster is left out of the entire book, Dope Incorporated, but Lyndon LaRoche is running for president of the United States, and the first person to endorse him, this is the New Solidarity, February the 19th, 1980. I endorse Lyndon LaRoche, is Roland McMaster, if only for the reason that he is committed to saving our next generation from drugs. I endorse Lyndon LaRoche, Jr. for President of the United States. Mr. LaRoche has answers to the issues of drug, inflation, energy, and economic growth, signed Roland McMaster, general organizer of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters. Now, if you get a book, The Hoffa Wars, by Dan Moldea, Moldea, and this book just came out, and you can't believe just one book, but I'm sure that it's pretty well documented in this book, in the index. They have at least 30 references to Mr. Roland McMaster, the man that is endorsing Lyndon LaRouche for President of the United States. And his links to the Teamster ganging up with his setting up the assassination of Jimmy Hoffa, his links to the assassination plans, the use of his agents that came into town, the people involved with McMaster who killed Jimmy Hoffa, how Jimmy Hoffa was crushed in a steel compactor for junk cars. The day Hoffa vanished, McMaster was in Gary, Indiana, but he pled the fifth. He wouldn't testify against himself. He had immunity, but all of his agents had been set up. This book carefully documents not only the murder of Jimmy Hoffa, set up by McMaster and Provenzano, the meeting, the underworld plots. It tells how Sam Giancana was murdered because he was going to testify about his CIA involvement in the assassination of John Kennedy, and the use of McMaster and Sheeran, Sheeran, and 3 New Jersey men linked with Provenzano in the murder of Jimmy Hoffa. Last week and the week before, I did a tape on this same Francis Sheeran in Philadelphia, the one that the FBI agent Welch calls a cesspool of organized crime and corruption. Mr. Sheeran is a leader of organized the Teamsters local union in Delaware, the Wilmington, Delaware Bureau, and he was charged with murdering 2 people and setting up the murder of 4 others, and also for arson and so forth, that he works with organized crime, and he's their chieftain in Pennsylvania and parts of New York State. Well, Mr. Sheeran was not only acquitted last week of the various murder charges, but he worked hand in glove with McMaster. Now, McMaster's name runs through this Hoffa book like water runs through a river. I mean, it just flows. I mean, almost every page they have the links of McMaster to Yaris. Yaris was the man that was with David Yaris with Jack Ruby. Jack Ruby had contact with these people up through October, November, before he killed Lee Harvey Oswald and covered up the Kennedy assassination. There's a quotation in this book on the Hoffa Wars, page 159. Ed Parton said that he saw David Yaris, Jack Ruby's friend, having dinner with Alan Dorfman, that's one of the ABSCAM Lab people being investigated, and Roland McMaster at the Andrew Jackson Hotel in the fall of 1963. In that part of the world, Yaris was known as a go-between between Trafficant and Marcello, not only for drugs, but for murder assassination teams. Over and over again in the book, The Hoffa Wars, it refers to McMaster's role in setting up the people that were going to off Jimmy Hoffa, that were involved in assassinations, in murders, in organized crime, in drug traffic. And if you want a profile of McMaster, write to me and I'll do a whole show on it. But it doesn't seem right to take a tape on it. You can buy this book for $2.75, a paperback, The Hoffa Wars, and it talks about Carmine Galante, Hoffa's friend, and how he turned against him. And the war between the Gambinos, again, the Carlo Gambino family that's involved with Michael Sindona, the Vatican, and the Cartergate operation, and Gambino's links to Trafficante, Carlos Marcello, and to McMaster. This book is filled with that gangster team and their drugs from Marseille that come to Trafficante, their international drug syndicate. And the interesting thing is that in the index of the Dope Incorporated, and one of the reasons I keep accusing them of being violently anti-Semitic, is that they leave out these wonderful names like Santos Trafficante and Bofalina, who worked with the CIA, and Joseph Bonanno, and the crime families of Gambinos and Giancana and Rosselli. You'd think that Meyer Lansky and Bronfman were the only Jewish crime people in the country that were flooding this country with narcotics. The actual flood of narcotics now doesn't even involve half the violently anti-Semitic people coming from the Persian area that don't have anything to do with the Jewish dealers that are being pushed out. But the book on the Hoffa Wars goes into McMaster's And the role he's played, it has a list of various murders and assassinations. I mean, what a lovely team. It goes into the murder of Salvatore Brugliosi, Castellito, Leon Cook. That was Jack Ruby's claim to fame, helping work with the Leon Cook, the union in Chicago of Eberly, of David Ferry, the assassination teams of Gambino, of Giancana, of Hicks, who was murdered, Jimmy Hoffa, and the teams of the murder of John Kennedy and Robert Kennedy. There's a murder of Mr. Reagan. That's when our ambassador to London, Mr. Annenberg, took over the wire services for Mr. Reagan and worked himself up. Mr. Vitale, and there's a whole list of murders here, about 30 or 40, and a can of worms that involves McMasters was a very early person in the Teamsters Union when it formed with a man named Mr. Johnson. Masters split with Jimmy Hoffa. When Jimmy Hoffa went to jail and they realized that he was a has-been and wouldn't get his power again, and Frank Fitzsimmons took over the Teamsters Union with all of its links to narcotics and organized crime and murders and ships being blown up and people being blown away. This guy, this wonderful character named McMasters, teamed with Fitzsimmons because they realized Hoffa was through, and then McMasters went to a friend's hotel where he brought in his agents, and that's when the meetings took place to murder Jimmy Hoffa. Roland McMaster is the first person listed, or general organizer of International Brotherhood of Teamsters, that is endorsing Lyndon LaRoche, and therefore you can expect a newspaper like New Solidarity to keep putting down the ABSCAM investigations, because even though they claim they don't want dope in America, the ABSCAM would get the dope dealers and the Teamsters that are involved in national, international narcotic traffic too, and the use of the mob and the assassination hit teams. And therefore, Lyndon LaRoche uses the endorsement of a man who has worked with these teams that have never been prosecuted, who've gotten off of charges, and his campaign is run with a recommendation of a character like that. So you have to be very careful of who is putting down ABSCAM and what their front purpose is, like to catch the dope ringers, link them all. You see, LaRoche doesn't like dope, but he doesn't like the Jewish dope dealers. He'll mention them over and over again, all the Jews. He may not like General Haig, but he won't refer to the fact that General Haig purposely set on the information of Richard Nixon with organized crime. All that Haig and his gang want to do is to take over the narcotics market that Nixon and Rebozo and the others had, and Murray Chotiner and Earl Warren, they want to take over for themselves, and so they're very selective, and we criticize Haig for some NATO decisions, but not for protecting the government from organized crime when he had absolute proof that Richard Nixon and the White House and half the Justice Department was involved in organized crime traffic. As I said before, I don't want to be in a position to always attack the Federal Bureau of Investigation, because when they make a decision to make a change, we should sit back and watch what they're doing and see if they're able to do it, and if they're not able to do it, who's stopping it. New York Times had an article by Jeff Girth, and as I said before on other tapes, he is an expert on organized crime and a very reliable writer. He's one to be trusted. He's not one of these flaky ones, and I'd hate to think that he was bought off. I really would. And it's in the New York Times, U.S. to seek charges from a wide variety of organized crime. This is from Kansas City, Missouri. The federal government is planning to seek a series of indictments around the country later this year against major organized crime figures, culminating in the most intensive investigation of racketeering since the early 60s. They've used electronic surveillance and undercover techniques, and they've gone into the upper echelons of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, public officials, lawyers, and businessmen, along with crime figures. Now, if one of the top men under Frank Fitzsimmons is this McMasters, who helped get rid of Hoffa, you can see why, if Lyndon LaRoche is using him to endorse his candidate, why they would be terrified that the upper echelon of the International Teamsters, that would have to be McMasters and Frank Fitzsimmons, would be involved. There's a wide variety of allegations that have been made, according to the New York Times. The major investigations into organized crime include a much wider range of allegations, among them the murder of union officials and others, racketeering, skimming of Las Vegas casino kickbacks, bribery of public officials, and misapplication of union funds. Now, if the FBI has the intent or the courage to do those things, Certainly, a group that published Dope Incorporated wouldn't mind, even if you were selecting a certain group to pull out, like McMaster, Fitzsimmons, or Dorfman. It would be worthwhile to get a few of them out. At the time of Watergate, it was worthwhile to get out Spiro Agnew and John Mitchell and Maurice Stans, and who worked with this Sheenan, the one who said that Mr. Allen was the go-between that gave who gave the money to get Hoffa out, was handing money to John Mitchell, the Attorney General. Martha Mitchell said Nixon is the Mafia. The Mafia is the White House. We got rid of Robert Haldeman and John Ehrlichman and Donald Segretti and Charles Colson and E. Howard Hunt. It didn't solve every problem in the world, and we certainly have a big hunk of scum around, but anyone they get begins to make other people a little more cautious, and it's a step in the right direction. The Bar-Lab investigation, according to Jeff Gerth, it will go to Las Vegas, it'll go to Chicago, it'll go to New Orleans, Milwaukee, Cleveland, St. Louis, and Detroit, and other cities, New York, of course. And what they're trying to do is to reflect the interlocking structure of organized crime. Now, being as Gerth has spent his life doing this investigation, I don't believe he would allow them to get away, and he may even be providing them with information. Remember, it was Mo Dalitz and LaCosta that sued him in the Penthouse article for linking LaCosta organization in San Diego to organized crime. And Jeff Gerth goes into the code name My Porn, the pornography industry. And, of course, this is where they're taking little boys and kidnapping them and photographing them and selling the pictures. When Mr. Parnell was arrested, they found nude pictures, Polaroid pictures, of this young boy that he had kidnapped, Stephen, and they were at the home. They could use these young people and sell these photographs, too, of these young kids. He was told the neighbors, he told a friend he's going to get another boy. Nobody asked where you're going to find this little boy or where you're going to go, but they use these children, and many of them have been taken from their homes, later murdered, photographed, sexually abused. Organized crime and pornography is more than just looking at Playboy or buying a gallery magazine or Penthouse or Hustler. It has more to do with children and almost infants from 2 and 3 and 4 years old that are being abused and kidnapped and photographed and sexually used as prostitutes and young adults around the cities of America. It's a big industry, and if they can infiltrate that and break it, it would be good. This article for Jeff Gerth says they're going into the casinos and pornography where crime has been sophisticated, and the Justice Department has to eradicate organized crime. He says, Gerth says the eradication of organized crime remains almost impossible, as illustrated by the overlap among the targets of the current investigations scrutinized by the federal government. It began under Robert Kennedy in 1960, and that's what I say, all these various 60, 80 investigations are all going to overlap and combine together. They go into the skimming money at the casinos in Las Vegas that are not reported to the Internal Revenue, and information that goes to Milwaukee and New Jersey about hidden casino money that they're getting into. And this article in the New York Times refers to agents of the FBI learned of a loan scheme in Chicago, Kansas City, Las Vegas, involving union money, billions of dollars in the central states. And at the heart of this scheme, they're using electronic information to intercept, and they're using FBI informants, and one of the people they are heading for is Alan Dorfman, who worked hand in glove with Fitzsimmons and Hoffa and McMasters and these people, and he's an insurance man with close ties to Mr. Savella and other organized crime figures in the union's affairs, and the federal government is going to take over the task force that Robert Kennedy had and see if they can get into the Vegas money that is going to various cities, and it is used for killing people, for keeping certain people in political power, the assemblies, the senates of each state, selecting the justices, the attorneys, the district attorneys, the justices of the Supreme Court, of killing judges on cases, of sideswiping cars of attorneys representing other people. Organized crime has a machinery or a network that totally controls investigations. And also the treachery is that they can leak grand jury information to somebody like Leslie Maitland of the New York Times and try to break the story. This is a very important project or endeavor, long overdue, that they probably figured they couldn't accomplish unless they did a broad sweep that would take several years using informers that were in the system. And any member of Congress or public official or press that puts this down, I would venture to guess that they have a lot to hide, and under the guise of national security or indecency, or that the Justice Department is playing bully, they're touching close to either that person or the person that put him into office. And this Neil Welch, the FBI agent from New York, who they're saying leaked the story, may have leaked it. There's a rumor that, or some charges in the press, that he leaked it because Mr. Civiletti for Jimmy Carter was going to call off the investigation, and he wanted to make sure it would go. That would make more sense if FBI boss Neil Welch leaked it to make sure that something got out and it wouldn't be covered up, because, as I say, this is the man that prosecuted Mr. Sindona and Mr. Scotto, that would open up Carter Gates and the links of organized crime to the CIA and Vatican. So Neil Welch could have leaked these stories to stop the investigation, or he could have leaked them because he wanted them to come out. We'll do more on Welch next week, maybe, because he's an interesting character, the FBI boss in New York, but there isn't any more time, and I will be doing many, many weeks of ABSCAM and Brylab and MyPorm and all those investigations, but save all the articles you can, pro or con, whether they're for the investigation or against it, and then we'll link them to some of our favorite politicians in the years to come. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel. We're out of time, so I'll be with you next week. You take care, and we'll be back next week.